Every single survivor in the Walking Dead universe believed they understood the dead. Slow, stupid, predictable. You put up a wall, you stayed quiet, you aimed for the head. That was the whole game. For over a decade of real time, and roughly the same inside the show's timeline, that belief kept people alive. Communities were built on it. Walls went up because of it. Children were raised inside those walls, with the understanding that the dead outside were dangerous, yes, but manageable, knowable, a problem with a solution that had already been solved. But here is the thing nobody realized until it was far too late. The dead were never as simple as anyone thought. And the proof was there from the very first episode. The first walker Rick Grimes ever killed was a little girl. She was standing in a gas station parking lot in King County, Georgia, and she was holding a teddy bear. She had bent down, reached underneath a car, picked it up, and was carrying it with her when Rick saw her from behind and thought she was alive. It was not until she turned around, revealing the decay and the dead eyes and the ruined face, that he understood what he was looking at. He shot her, and then he moved on, because there was a world ending around him, and he did not have the luxury of sitting with what he had just seen. But think about what that moment actually means. A walker, a reanimated corpse driven by nothing but the brainstem, according to every piece of science the show would later establish, had recognized an object, bent down, retrieved it with fine motor coordination, and was carrying it. That is not mindless shambling. That is recognition. That is memory. That is something in the brain that should not have been active, firing anyway, and she was not the only one. Morgan Jones, the man who saved Rick's life in that very first episode, was living in a boarded-up house with his son Dwayne. And every single night, Morgan's wife Jenny, who had died and turned, came back to that house. Not randomly, not because the herd happened to drift that direction. She came back because she remembered it. She walked up to the front door, looked through the peephole, and turned the doorknob. She could not get in, but she tried. Every night, she tried. Morgan watched through the window with tears running down his face because he knew what it meant. Some part of his wife was still in there. Not enough to save, not enough to bring back, but enough to find her way home. In a later episode from that same first season, Rick and Glenn were trapped near a department store in downtown Atlanta, surrounded by a herd. And in that herd, a walker picked up a large rock and began smashing it against the glass doors. Not scratching, not pushing, smashing with force and purpose, using a tool to break a barrier. Greg Nicotero, the show's legendary special effects supervisor, later confirmed on the after-show Talking Dead that this was deliberate. It was written into the scene on purpose. The walkers in those early episodes were supposed to be doing things like this, and then they stopped. When Frank Darabont, who directed the pilot and oversaw the first season, departed the show, the walker behaviour was quietly standardised. The dead became what everyone remembers them as through seasons 2 through 10. Slow, dumb, herd-driven, dangerous in numbers but individually about as threatening as a drunk person trying to grab you in a parking lot. The smarter, stranger walkers from season 1 vanished without explanation. For years, fans debated whether those early scenes were mistakes, inconsistencies from a show still finding its footing. Maybe the writers had not yet decided what walkers could and could not do. Maybe it was just sloppy. The answer, when it finally came more than a decade later, was none of those things. Showrunner Angela Kang said it plainly. In some way, it is a throwback to some of the walkers we saw back in the very first season of The Walking Dead. Not everyone ever encountered those walkers. It is almost like it was a variant that was just regional. Producer Scott Gimple backed this up while being careful about the language. He said he would not use the word smart for the walkers, but acknowledged that something was going on, something different, something that Jenna at the CDC had been deeply intrigued by. And that brings us to Dr. Edwin Jenner, because to understand what variant walkers are and where they came from, you have to start where the virus itself started. The wildfire virus, which is the official name for the pathogen that ended human civilization originated in a French biomedical laboratory called La Biomédecine DDMI. This is not speculation or fan theory. This was confirmed across multiple shows in the Walking Dead universe, most explicitly in the post-credits scene of the series finale of The Walking Dead World Beyond, which aired in December 2021. At that laboratory, 2 research teams operated, the Primrose team and the Violet team. What exactly they were studying before the virus escaped has never been fully explained, but the graffiti sprayed across the walls of the abandoned lab tells you everything you need to know. Les morts sont nés ici. The dead are born here. The Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta discovered the wildfire virus on April 16, 2010. The man who documented it was Dr. Edwin Jenner, a virologist who would eventually become the last living scientist at the CDC. His wife, Dr. Candice Jenner, was also a researcher there. She was brilliant. She was possibly closer to understanding the virus than anyone else in America, and when the CDC was overrun by walkers during the fall of Atlanta, Candice Jenner was bitten. What happened next is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire franchise. Rather than simply dying, Candice Jenner volunteered. She allowed her own infection and reanimation to be recorded for science. She became Test Subject 19, the CDC's only documented case of a full infection cycle from living human to walking corpse, captured on brain imaging equipment in real time. Her husband watched the entire thing. Jenner later showed Rick's group the brain scans from Test Subject 19, and what those scans revealed became the foundational understanding of how walkers work in this universe. The virus kills the host, then it restarts the brainstem, and only the brainstem. The parts of the brain responsible for higher thought, memory, personality, decision-making, empathy, love, all of it stays dark. What comes back is just enough to make the body move, just enough to make it hungry. Everything that person was, Jenner said, is gone forever. But that is not entirely what happened with Jenny Jones turning the doorknob. That is not entirely what happened with the little girl picking up the teddy bear. And Jenner himself knew it, because while he was conducting his research in the final days before the CDC went dark, he was communicating with the French lab, and the French were telling him things that did not match his data. In the wildfire transmissions that Jenner sent to France, preserved on the hard drives that a Violet team scientist would retrieve over a decade later, Jenner mentioned something specific. He talked about variant cohorts, types of walkers that were behaving differently from anything he had observed in America. The French had reported them. Jenner had not seen anything like them. He was fascinated and he was worried, because if the virus could produce different kinds of reanimated dead, then the assumption that all walkers were the same, that all walkers were predictable, that all walkers could be managed with the same simple set of rules, that assumption was wrong. And wrong assumptions in the apocalypse get people killed. Jenner told Rick's group something else that night at the CDC, something that would not pay off in the story for another 13 years of real-world television. He said the French were the last ones to hold out, as far as I know. While our people were bolting out the doors and committing suicide in the hallways, they stayed in the labs till the end. They thought they were close to a solution. Close to a solution. The French scientists who had created the virus that ended the world believed they could also end the virus. And in trying to do so, in trying to short-circuit the reanimation process itself, they created something far worse. A variant strain of wildfire that did not stop the dead from coming back. It made them come back faster, stronger, more aggressive, and more intelligent. We will get to the full details of what happened in that lab later. For now, what matters is that the variant escaped. It spread through Europe, transforming the walker landscape of an entire continent into something survivors in America could not have imagined. While Rick's group was building fences and learning to herd walkers with noise, the dead in France were climbing walls, breaking down reinforced doors, and attacking with a ferocity that made the slow shambling herds of Georgia look almost quaint by comparison. The wildfire pandemic was declared global by the CDC on August 25, 2010. 2 days later, on August 27th, civilization collapsed in what the shows refer to as the Fall. Everything after that, every community built, every war fought, every life lost, happened inside a world shaped by a virus that was never one single thing. It was always mutating. It was always producing variants. The survivors just did not know it yet. Or rather, some of them did know. The signs were there from the very beginning, in a gas station parking lot in Georgia, where a dead little girl picked up a teddy bear and held it the way a child holds something precious. The signs were there every night outside Morgan's window, where his dead wife came home because some fragment of her remembered what home was. The signs were there in every strange moment across 11 seasons that fans explained away as inconsistencies or oversights or bad writing. They were none of those things. They were the first tremors of something that would eventually shake the entire world of The Walking Dead to its foundations. And for 10 years, almost nobody paid attention. The virus was never one thing. From the very beginning, it was changing. The question was always when, not if, those changes would become impossible to ignore. For about 10 years after the world ended, the survivors of The Walking Dead lived inside a very specific understanding of what the dead were. And that understanding, for all its limitations, worked. It kept people alive. It allowed communities to form, to grow, to develop something resembling a normal life inside the ruins of the old world. The rules were simple and they were reliable. Walkers were slow. Walkers were drawn to sound. Walkers could be distracted, diverted, and destroyed with a blade or a bullet to the brain. Walls kept them out. Silence kept you safe. And if you were smart and careful and just a little bit lucky, you could live alongside them indefinitely. This was the era of The Walking Dead that most viewers remember. Seasons 2 through 10, roughly a decade of television and a roughly equivalent stretch of time inside the story. And during that entire period, the real threat was almost never the walkers themselves. It was people. The governor of Woodbury, the cannibals of Terminus, the wolves who carved W's into the foreheads of the people they killed. Negan and the Saviors, who ruled through a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire, and the absolute certainty that resistance was futile. The Whisperers, who wore the skins of the dead and walked among herds as a form of camouflage and territorial control. One after another, the enemies that Rick's group faced were human. The walkers were the weather. Dangerous, yes, capable of killing you if you were careless, but predictable in the way that a storm is predictable. You could see it coming. You could prepare for it. You could survive it if you respected it. And inside that safety, inside that hard-won confidence in their ability to manage the dead, the survivors stopped looking closely. They stopped noticing the small things that did not fit the pattern, because there were small things, scattered across those middle seasons, buried inside episodes that nobody thought to look at twice. There were moments that did not quite match the rules everyone had agreed upon. The prison flu outbreak in Season 4 is one of the earliest and most important of these moments, and almost nobody talks about it in the context of variant walkers. Here is what happened. A sickness began spreading through the prison, the fortified complex where Rick's group had settled after the fall of Woodbury. A young man named Patrick, who had seemed perfectly healthy earlier that day, began coughing violently and collapsed in the prison showers late at night. He died on the floor with blood running from his mouth and his eyes. And shortly after dying, he reanimated and began killing people in their sleep. What made this different from a standard walker outbreak was not the reanimation itself. Everyone in the Walking Dead universe carries the wildfire virus. Everyone who dies, regardless of cause, comes back. That had been established since Season 1, when Jenna whispered the secret to Rick. What made the prison flu different was the speed and the symptoms. The victims died rapidly, and the walkers they produced had blood trailing from their eyes and orifices. They were noticeably more aggressive than the standard dead. The prison's doctor, a man named Subramanian, identified the illness as something similar to a pre-apocalypse swine flu, the kind of disease that spread through close quarters, carried by pigs and birds. Rick had been tending pigs in the prison yard. The conditions were ripe for exactly this kind of outbreak. But there is another way to read this event, one that the show itself did not explore at the time, but that the larger universe would later validate. The walkers produced by the prison flu were not standard walkers. They were products of a disease that had passed through the wildfire virus, mutated inside it, and come out the other side as something slightly different. They were, in a very real sense, an early form of variant, not the climbing, door-opening kind, but a kind that demonstrated something critical about the wildfire virus itself. It was not static. It interacted with other pathogens. It changed when exposed to new biological material. It was, in the language of virology, a living system capable of adaptation. General Beale of the Civic Republic military would later articulate this idea with terrifying clarity in his classified echelon briefing, the highest level intelligence document in the CRM's archives. He described walkers as, and this is close to his exact words, a billion Petri dishes stumbling around in the sun, waiting to transmit God knows what to us, while the virus transforms into God knows what. That single sentence captures something that the survivors of the prison flu had glimpsed without fully understanding. The walkers were not just a threat because they bit people and ate flesh. They were a threat because they were a planetary-scale biological experiment, billions of reanimated bodies carrying an evolving virus through every environment on Earth, exposed to every pathogen, every chemical, every climatic condition, and mutating continuously. The prison flu was a small preview of what that mutation could look like. A virus passing through walker bodies, picking up characteristics from swine flu, producing walkers with bleeding eyes and heightened aggression. It was contained. The group quarantined the sick, treated what they could, and put down the rest. Life at the prison continued, briefly, before the governor destroyed it entirely. But the lesson was there for anyone paying attention. The dead were not finished changing. The Whisperers, who dominated seasons 9 and 10, demonstrated something else about walkers that would become critically important once variants appeared in force. Alpha and her followers wore the preserved skin of walkers as masks and walked among herds, exploiting the dead's inability to distinguish between living humans covered in walker scent and actual walkers. The Whisperers proved that walker behavior followed identifiable, predictable patterns. The dead moved in herds. They responded to sound. They could be led, directed, even controlled by someone who understood their instincts well enough to mimic them. This was a profound insight, and the survivors who fought the Whisperers absorbed it deeply. They learned to think of walkers as a system that could be manipulated. Herds could be diverted. Walkers could be used as weapons, as barriers, as camouflage. The dead had rules, and if you knew the rules, you had power over them. The problem, which nobody recognized at the time, is that rules only work as long as the thing you're applying them to stays the same. The moment the walkers changed, the moment even a small number of them developed abilities that fell outside the established rules, every strategy built on those rules became potentially fatal. Walls that kept out slow, stupid walkers would not keep out walkers that could climb. Doors that held against mindless pushing would not hold against walkers that could turn handles. Silence that made you invisible to herd-driven dead would not protect you from dead that could actively hunt. The entire infrastructure of survival, everything that had been built across a decade of desperate effort, was designed for a version of the dead that was already being replaced, and nobody knew it because nobody was looking. Meanwhile, far from the communities of Virginia and Georgia and Ohio, the Civic Republic military was looking. The CRM, which operated in secret from the Civic Republic of Philadelphia, had access to resources and intelligence that no other group in America possessed. They had scientists, they had laboratories, they had a structured military with ranks and protocols and classified documents, and their assessment of the Walker situation was significantly grimmer than anything Rick's group or the Commonwealth or any other community had arrived at independently. The CRM's research program, Project Votus, had been studying reanimation for years. Dr. Leo Bennett and other scientists worked under CRM supervision to understand the virus and potentially develop a way to neutralize it. What they found was not encouraging. The wildfire virus was not degrading over time the way some pathogens do. It was not burning itself out. If anything, it was becoming more complex, producing occasional specimens that did not behave the way standard walkers behaved, specimens that moved differently, reacted differently, and were significantly harder to kill. General Beale, the commander of the ZRM, had synthesized all of this research into a single classified conclusion that he shared only during the Echelon briefing, the highest level of intelligence clearance in the Civic Republic. His conclusion was that Walker-borne disease would eventually cause the extinction of the human race. Not might, would. The walkers were evolving, and the trajectory of that evolution pointed toward an endpoint where the living could no longer coexist with the dead. The clock was ticking, and according to Beale's assessment, it could not be stopped. It could only be managed by ensuring that at least one large, well-defended population of humans survived long enough to outlast the threat. This was the reasoning behind the CRM's most horrifying decisions. They had destroyed the city of Omaha and its entire campus colony. They were planning to destroy Portland. They maintained spies in communities across the continent, sabotaging and manipulating settlements they viewed as competitors for limited resources. All of it, every atrocity, was justified internally by the belief that human extinction was coming, and only the Civic Republic had a chance of surviving it. Whether Beale was right about the extinction timeline is something the Walking Dead universe has not definitively answered. But his assessment of what the Walkers were becoming has been validated by everything that happened afterward. The variants were coming, the dead were changing, and the communities that had spent a decade building their survival around a set of predictable Walker behaviors were about to discover just how dangerous it is to stop paying attention to something simply because you think you already understand it. The quiet years were ending. The false security was about to shatter. And the first crack would come not from France, not from the CRM's classified briefings, not from any laboratory or military installation. It would come from a fairground on the road to Oceanside, where a man named Aaron would pull the face off a walker and realise, with a cold shock of recognition, that everything he thought he knew about the dead was wrong. But before we get to that moment, before we arrive at the night everything changed for the survivors in America, we need to go to France. Because what happened in that French laboratory is the origin point for every single variant walker in the entire Walking Dead universe. Every climber that scaled a wall, every burner whose touch dissolved flesh, every amper that charged with black eyes and acidic blood. All of it traces back to one place, one team of scientists, and one catastrophic mistake. The Walking Dead World Beyond was the third television series in the franchise, and by most measures, it was the least watched and the least discussed. It ran for 2 seasons on AMC between 2020 and 2021, focused on a group of teenagers living inside one of the CRM's allied communities, and received mixed reviews throughout its run. But the series finale, titled The Last Light, contained something in its final 5 minutes that fundamentally changed the entire Walking Dead universe. A post-credits scene that connected directly to Season 1 of the original show and set up everything that would follow in every spin-off that came after. The scene takes place inside La Biomédecine de DMI, the French laboratory where the wildfire virus was created. The lab has been abandoned for over a decade. It is dusty, dark, and covered in graffiti. Les morts sont ici. The dead are born here. Whoever spray-painted those words on the walls knew exactly what had happened inside those rooms. They were not guessing, they were accusing. A woman enters. She is a scientist, a member of the Violet team, one of the 2 research groups that had operated in this lab before the world ended. She has come back after all these years because she still had hope. Hope that the Primrose team, the other research group, might have somehow returned from America to continue their work. The Primrose team had been at a conference in Toledo, Ohio, when the outbreak hit. They never came back to France, but this woman believed, or needed to believe, that if they returned, they could finish what had been started. They could end the plague, even after all this time. She dusts off old hard drives and begins downloading transmissions, and the voice that plays from those files is one that Walking Dead fans had not heard in over a decade. It is Dr. Edwin Jenner. The transmissions are from 2010, from the final weeks before the CDC in Atlanta went dark, and they reveal that Jenner had been in active communication with the French lab throughout that period. He had been sharing data with them. They had been sharing data with him. And in those transmissions, Jenner says something that reframes everything the audience thought they knew about walkers. He says he wants to know more about the variant cohorts the French had referred to in their last communication. Variant cohorts, that is what Jenner called them. Types of walkers that the French were reporting, but that Jenner had never observed in the United States. Something was happening to the dead in Europe that was not happening in America, at least not in any widespread or obvious way. Jenner was intrigued. He wanted more data. He wanted to understand what was different about these walkers and why. He never got the chance. The CDC fell. Atlanta was overrun. Jenner lost contact with every research facility in the world. The French lab was the last one he had any connection to, and then they went silent too. Jenner spent his final days alone in the CDC, watching his wife's brain scans on a loop, before Rick's group arrived, and he ultimately chose to let the building's decontamination protocol destroy the lab and everything inside it. But the French lab did not simply go quiet because communications failed. Something happened there, something violent, and the post-credits scene of World Beyond reveals what it was. While the scientist is working at her computer, a man appears. He has a gun. He is not a walker, not a soldier, not anyone affiliated with the CRM or any organised group. He is a vigilante, one of the French survivors who had discovered the truth about what La Biomedicine DDMI had done to the world. He knows what the Violet team and the Primrose team were responsible for, and he is consumed with the specific kind of fury that only comes from knowing who ended everything. The exchange between them, spoken in French with subtitles, is one of the most important pieces of dialogue in the entire franchise. The woman tells him that the Primrose team was not here when it happened. They were at the conference in Toledo. She had hoped against hope that they might come back. If they returned to their work, they might end all this. The man raises his gun. He says, "They should be dead. If they are not, and they somehow come back like you, we will not jail them like the others. We will kill them." And then he says the line that confirmed what fans had suspected for more than a decade. "End this? You started this, all the teams. Then you made it worse." He fires a single round into her back. She falls. And then in a moment that would have been unremarkable in any other Walking Dead scene, but was absolutely chilling in this specific context, she reanimates. Not in minutes, not in hours the way it usually takes in the American episodes. She comes back in approximately 30 seconds. Her eyes open, she rises, and she does not shuffle, she does not stumble, she does not moan and reach with uncoordinated arms, the way every walker in the original show had done for 11 seasons. She runs, she sprints to the door through which the man had left, and she pounds on it with a speed and a violence that bends the metal frame. She is fast, she is strong, she is focused on the door because she remembers that is where the living thing went. She is something that no walker in America had ever been on screen. Scott Gimple, the chief content officer of the Walking Dead franchise, discussed this scene afterward with some care. He said he would not call that walker superpowered. He noted that the door was thin, that what the audience saw was not necessarily the end state of that walker. But he also confirmed that what Jenner had been talking about, those variant cohorts, those differences he was so intrigued by, represented something real and significant, something that the franchise was going to continue exploring. So what exactly did the French scientists do? The answer, pieced together from World Beyond, Daryl Dixon, and the Walking Dead Wiki's compiled research, goes like this. The Violet team at La Biomedicine DDMI experimented with cardiac plaques. These were biological mechanisms designed to short-circuit the reanimation process. The goal was elegant in theory. If you could prevent the brainstem from restarting after death, you could stop walkers from being created entirely. No more reanimation, no more Walking Dead. The apocalypse could be functionally ended, not by killing every walker already roaming the earth, but by ensuring no new ones were ever made. The experiment failed catastrophically. Instead of preventing reanimation, the cardiac plaque research created an adverse variant of the wildfire virus, a mutation that did not stop the dead from coming back. It made them come back with drastically reduced resurrection times and massively increased aggression, strength, and intelligence. The walkers produced by this variant strain were not the slow, shuffling dead that America had spent a decade learning to manage. They were something new, something that the French survivors, trapped on a continent with these things, had every reason to be terrified of. And the variant escaped. It spread through Europe, transforming the walker landscape of the entire continent into something fundamentally different from what existed across the Atlantic. While Rick's group in Virginia was herding walkers with noisemakers and hiding behind chain-link fences, the dead in France were climbing, running, and hunting with a purpose and intensity that made the American walkers look almost docile by comparison. The French lab's failure created the conditions for every variant that would follow. The full taxonomy of walker types that the franchise has now established all connects back to what happened inside LA Biomedicine DDMI, either directly through the escaped variant strain or indirectly through subsequent mutations and deliberate human experimentation with the variant's properties. Lurkers are the dormant type. They lie still, sometimes for extended periods, in a state that resembles true death until something disturbs them. A loud noise, a vibration, the proximity of living flesh. They are the walkers you step over in a dark hallway, thinking they are simply dead, and then they grab your ankle. Individually, they are the least threatening variant, but their ability to remain completely undetected makes them responsible for an enormous number of deaths throughout the franchise. Roamers are the standard walker. They move constantly, driven by hunger, following sound and scent. Some roamers retain a fragment of spatial memory from their former lives, returning to places that were important to them. Morgan's wife Jenny, returning to her house every night, was a roamer exhibiting this specific behaviour. The show confirmed that this is a genuine variant trait, not an error or inconsistency. Climbers are walkers with enhanced intelligence and physical ability. They can scale vertical surfaces, they can open doors by turning handles, they can use objects as weapons, they can identify weak points in fortifications and exploit them, sometimes opening gates to allow entire herds through behind them. Their eyes retain visible pupils where standard walkers' irises are fully clouded. They are rare even in the later seasons, but their rarity makes them more dangerous because no community has protocols designed to handle them. Every wall in the Walking Dead world was built to stop roamers. Climbers make walls irrelevant. Cohorts display increased speed, agility, strength, intelligence, and durability. They resurrect in approximately 30 seconds. They can withstand physical impacts that would destroy normal walkers, surviving blows to the head that would put down a standard roamer. You still have to destroy the brain to kill them, but reaching the brain through their enhanced durability is significantly harder. The cohort strain appears to be a naturally occurring mutation connected to the French lab's escaped variant, and the French scientist in the World Beyond post-credits scene was likely exhibiting cohort characteristics. Burners possess acidic blood and skin. Their touch burns living flesh on contact, producing chemical burn-like wounds. Their entire bodies are corrosive, to the point where Daryl Dixon used a dead burner's body to dissolve overgrown vines blocking his escape route in one scene. Whether burners are a direct creation of the French lab experiments or a secondary mutation that evolved from the escaped variant strain is something the franchise has not conclusively settled. What is confirmed is that burners are prevalent in France in a way they are not in America, and that their existence is connected to the experiments at la Biomedicine DDMI. And then there are AMPers, which are not natural variants at all. AMPers are the product of deliberate human engineering, created by injecting a chemical serum into recently dead or already reanimated walkers. They are the most extreme and most dangerous type of walker in the entire franchise. But AMPers are a story that belongs to France, to a woman named Genet, and to a scientist named Dr. Lafleur, who turned the horror of the variant virus into a weapon of war. The French tried to kill death itself. What they created instead was a death that could run. Season 11 of The Walking Dead, the final season of the original show, ran for 24 episodes across 3 parts between 2021 and 2022. And buried inside part 3 of that final season, in episode 19, was the moment that the variant walker story officially arrived in America. The episode was called Variant, just that. One word, no subtitle, no clever double meaning. The title told you exactly what you were about to see, and what the show had been building towards since its very first episode, 13 years earlier. Aaron, Jerry, Lydia, and Elijah were travelling toward Oceanside, one of the Allied communities that had been part of the coalition during the Whisperer War. They were on foot, moving through the Virginia countryside, and they stopped for the night at an abandoned fairground, the kind of place that litters the post-apocalyptic landscape in the Walking Dead universe. Rusted rides, overgrown pathways, buildings with doors that had not been opened in years. They secured the perimeter, checked the fences, locked the gates, and settled in for the night with a fire going and a watch rotation established. Standard procedure. The kind of thing these people had done 1,000 times before. Lydia heard it first, wood creaking, hinges groaning in the distance. She mentioned it to Aaron, who was on watch with her. He told her they had triple-checked everything. It was probably just the wind. Then they heard a gate open, not bang open from pressure, not collapse from decay, open, the way a gate opens when something lifts the latch. Lydia said it immediately. Wind did not do that. Aaron agreed. They went to investigate, and what they found inside the fairground was a herd. At least 50 walkers, pouring through the opened gate and spreading across the grounds. Aaron and Lydia engaged, putting down several, but something was wrong almost immediately. When Lydia stabbed one of the walkers through the chest with her staff weapon, the walker grabbed the staff and pulled her toward it. That is not something walkers do. Walkers grab at flesh, they bite, they claw, they do not grip weapons and use leverage. The group retreated, gathered Jerry and Elijah, and tried to hold a defensive position inside one of the buildings. But the walkers kept coming, and then a doorknob began turning, not from the inside, from the outside. A walker was standing on the other side of a closed door and turning the knob. Jerry threw his weight against the door to hold it shut, and as he did, he asked the question that every single viewer was thinking. When did the dead start opening doors? Aaron assumed it had to be whisperers. That was the only explanation that fit his experience. Whisperers wore walker skin masks and could move among herds undetected. A whisperer could open a gate. A whisperer could turn a doorknob. It had to be whisperers. The group fought their way to the roof. Jerry sat against a box, catching his breath, while Aaron and the others planned their next move. And behind Jerry, unnoticed, the same walker that had grabbed Lydia's weapon climbed onto the roof. It did not stumble up by chance. It did not fall from a higher surface. It climbed. It pulled itself up with coordinated movements. got to its feet, and then reached down and picked up a rock that it intended to use as a weapon against Jerry's head. Aaron saw it just in time. He tackled the walker, punching it, grappling with it, and in a moment of desperate instinct, he grabbed the thing's face. Because that is what you do when you think it is a whisperer. You grab the face and you pull. You tear off the skin mask to reveal the living person underneath. That is how you prove it is human. That is how you end the deception. Aaron pulled, and the face came off, but there was no living person underneath. There was exposed muscle, there was skull, there were teeth still snapping. The face had torn away because it was real decomposing flesh, not a mask. This was not a whisperer. This was a walker. A walker that had opened a gate, climbed a wall, picked up a rock, and attempted to use that rock to kill a man. Aaron killed it with a knife through the brain. Standard method, still effective even on this new kind of dead. And then he and Jerry stood there, staring at the remains, trying to process what they had just experienced. Jerry said it simply. How the hell did a walker do that? The next morning, after clearing the remaining walkers from the fairground, Aaron tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. He offered a theory that the show would validate across its remaining episodes. He said there were roamers and lurkers. Everybody knew that. He said people had all seen walkers that came back to places they remembered. He had heard stories, he said, about walkers that could climb walls and open doors. He had never been sure if those stories were real. Maybe, he said, there were other kinds too. That was the moment. Not delivered as a dramatic revelation, with swelling music and a stunned silence. Delivered as a quiet theory from a tired man sitting in the morning light after a night of fighting, trying to reconcile what he had seen with everything he thought he knew. Maybe there are other kinds too. Maybe the dead are not all the same. Maybe they never were. What Aaron encountered at that fairground was a climber, the rarest of the naturally occurring variant types, a walker with enhanced intelligence, the ability to use tools, and sufficient physical coordination to scale vertical surfaces and manipulate objects. It had opened the gate to let the herd in. It had climbed to the roof. It had selected a rock as a weapon and prepared to use it. Each of those actions required some form of cognitive function that standard walkers simply do not possess. And the timing was not accidental. The variant appeared in America at almost the exact same time that the world beyond post-credits scene was revealing the French lab's role in creating these mutations. The franchise was telling two stories simultaneously, one about the origin of variants in France, and one about their arrival in the United States, and the overlap was deliberate. The Primrose team had been in Toledo, Ohio, when the outbreak began. Toledo is in the same general region as the Commonwealth, the massive community in Ohio where the final season of The Walking Dead was set. The implication, never stated explicitly but strongly suggested by geography and timing, is that the Primrose team's presence in Ohio may have introduced the variant strain to the American Midwest. The variants Aaron encountered near Virginia may have spread south from that initial introduction point. This was not the last time climbers would appear in the final season. In the series finale itself, during the massive battle at the Commonwealth, the variant threat went from isolated encounter to full-scale crisis. The Commonwealth was the largest, most organised, most heavily defended community in the entire Walking Dead franchise. It had walls. It had a trained military force led by General Mercer. It had infrastructure, government, and protocols for dealing with walker threats that had been refined over years of operation. And when the herd arrived at the Commonwealth's gates during the finale, the initial response was standard. Hold the walls, deploy troops to the East Gate, manage the situation. Then a soldier named Livitz, stationed on top of the wall, looked down and saw something that broke every assumption the Commonwealth had ever operated under. A walker was climbing the wall, not pressing against it, not being pushed up by the mass of bodies behind it, climbing it with coordinated hand and foot movements, scaling the vertical surface the way a person would climb a ladder. Livitz shouted a warning into his radio and shot the climber as it reached the top, but he did not see the second climber coming up directly behind him. It reached the top of the wall, attacked Livitz, removed his helmet, and bit him. As the two struggled and the climber began feeding on Livitz, his body slumped against the gate controls. The gate opened, and the entire herd flooded into the Commonwealth. In the hospital, where Judith Grimes was being treated for a gunshot wound, Carol and Daryl saw another variant in action. A walker approached the reinforced glass doors at the front of the hospital, and rather than pressing against them mindlessly, picked up a brick and began smashing the glass with it. Carol killed it when it broke through, but more followed. Walkers were breaking in from multiple directions, and the coordinated quality of their assault, the way they found different entry points and exploited them simultaneously, was unlike anything the characters had experienced before. Out in the streets, Negan saw a walker climbing over a barricade, and the only thing he could think to say, because the only appropriate response when the fundamental rules of your survival change in real time, was "what the fuck?" General Mercer, before being arrested by Pamela Milton's loyalists, tried to warn his subordinate Vickers that something was different about this herd. "Something strange is going on outside," he told her. "You have to listen to me. This is bigger than Pamela's bullshit." He understood, even in that chaotic moment, that the variant walkers represented a qualitative change in the threat level. This was not just a bigger herd. This was a different kind of herd. The Coalition's response to the variants during the series finale tells you everything about how seriously the show was taking this evolution. In every previous major walker engagement across 11 seasons, the standard approach had been to divert the herd, lead them away with noise, open a path, let them pass through and clean up afterward. That approach requires a fundamental assumption, that walkers will follow sound mindlessly and can be redirected without meaningful resistance. Mercer explicitly said that strategy would not work against the variants. They were too dangerous to just lead away. Instead, the plan that Aaron and the others executed involved physically engaging the walkers with melee weapons and riot shields to create a corridor, then luring the entire herd into the estates, the wealthiest district of the Commonwealth, rigging the area with fuel from the depot and explosives wired through the private sewer system, and detonating the whole thing. They destroyed an entire neighborhood of the most advanced community in the Walking Dead universe because the variants had made every less destructive option obsolete. The series finale of The Walking Dead was not just an ending to the original show, it was a declaration that the rules had changed permanently. The walkers that humanity had spent a decade learning to live alongside were evolving into something that could not be managed by the old methods. Walls would not hold, doors would not stop them, silence would not hide you from something that could actively search for you. The comfortable equilibrium between the living and the dead, imperfect and bloody as it had always been, was over. And while the survivors of the Commonwealth were grappling with climbers in Ohio on the other side of the Atlantic, a man named Daryl Dixon was about to discover that the variant problem in Europe was orders of magnitude worse than anything America had seen. Because in France, the variants had not just evolved, they had been weaponized. Daryl Dixon woke up on a beach in France with no memory of how he got there. That is how the first episode of The Walking Dead, Daryl Dixon, begins, and it sets the tone for everything that follows. Daryl is a man completely out of his element. He has survived over a decade of the apocalypse in America. He has killed more walkers than he could count. He has fought the governor, the saviors, the whisperers, and everything in between. There is arguably no living person in the Walking Dead universe more experienced at dealing with the dead. And within hours of waking up on that French beach, Daryl learned that everything he knew was incomplete. His first encounter with a burner happened quickly and without warning. A walker that looked like any other walker, the same grey skin, the same dead eyes, the same shambling gait, reached out and touched his arm. Not bit, touched. And and where it touched, Daryl's skin blistered and burned as though someone had pressed a hot iron against it. The walker's skin was acidic. Its blood was acidic. Its entire body was a corrosive weapon that could wound you without ever opening its mouth. Daryl eventually found his way to a convent where a group of nuns took him in and treated his wound. They cauterized the burn because leaving it untreated risked the same kind of spreading infection that a bite would cause. Isabelle Carrière, one of the people at the convent, explained the situation to Daryl with a matter-of-factness that told him everything about what life in France had been like. She said that burners were just one kind of walker in France. Just one kind. She said it the way you might say that rain was just one kind of weather. Not as a revelation, but as basic information about the world she lived in. For Daryl, whose entire concept of walkers had been formed in America, where every single one of the dead behaved more or less the same way for more than a decade, this was a fundamental shock, and it was about to get much worse. The story of how variants became weaponized in France begins with a woman named Marion Genet and the specific kind of rage that only comes from watching the people you love be destroyed while the powerful protect themselves. Before the fall, before civilization collapsed, Jeanette had been a working-class woman living in Paris. When the wildfire pandemic hit France and the dead began to rise, the French government did what Genet would never forget and never forgive. They protected the art, they protected the wealthy. They loaded the great works from the Louvre onto barges and shipped them down the Seine to the country estates and chateaux of the powerful, while ordinary families huddled in terror under bridges and were devoured by walkers 5 feet away from the people who were supposed to protect them. Jeanette's husband, Adrien, was killed during the collapse, eaten by walkers, while Jeanette watched from the other side of a glass barrier, 5 feet away, close enough to see every detail, not close enough to do anything about it. That experience created Jeanette, not the person she had been before, but the person she became. She emerged from the collapse as a leader. She formed the Pouvoir du Vivant, the power of the living, a nationalist paramilitary organisation that positioned itself as the voice of ordinary French people who had been abandoned by their government. Genet was charismatic, ruthless, and driven by a conviction that the old order had failed because it valued the wrong things: art over people, wealth over survival, the powerful over the rest. The Pouvoir du Vivant grew. It took control of most of Paris and eventually spread its influence across much of the country. Jeanette became the most powerful person in post-collapse France, operating from a headquarters called Maison Mère. And at some point during her rise to power, Genet learned something that changed the trajectory of everything she was building. She learned that La Biomédecine DMI, the French laboratory, was responsible for creating the wildfire virus and its variants. The very catastrophe that had killed her husband, that had destroyed civilization, that had turned the world into an endless graveyard, had been born in a lab run by scientists who thought they were smarter than nature. Jeanette did not destroy that knowledge. She weaponized it. Under Genet's direction, a scientist named Dr. Lafleur developed what became known as the AMPA serum. The serum was an injectable compound that could be administered to recently killed humans or to existing walkers. When injected, the serum triggered a rapid and violent transformation. The subject's eyes turned completely black. Dark veins protruded across the skin. The walker became faster, stronger, more aggressive, and significantly harder to kill. Its blood became acidic, capable of burning living flesh on contact. These were AMPAs, the most extreme and most dangerous variant in the entire Walking Dead franchise, and they were entirely a product of human engineering. But the AMPAs were not precise weapons. They were blunt instruments with severe limitations that Jeanette and Lafleur struggled to control throughout both seasons of Daryl Dixon. The first limitation was instability. Not every subject responded to the serum the same way. Some reanimated as functional AMPAs, others had their heads explode, literally. The serum caused catastrophic cranial pressure in some subjects, resulting in a violent and graphic death after death that was useless to Genet's military ambitions. Lafleur was constantly adjusting dosages, trying to find the concentration that would reliably produce functional ampers without the failures. The second limitation was controllability. Ampers were consumed by an uncontrollable bloodlust that made standard walker hunger look almost passive by comparison. Standard walkers want to eat. Ampers want to destroy. The distinction matters because it means ampers do not simply pursue the nearest living target. They attack anything, including each other. In one of the most striking scenes in the first season, Genet ordered Lafleur to dart 4 chained walkers with the serum simultaneously during a gladiator event. 3 of the 4 successfully mutated into ampers. The 4th had its head explode from the serum, and then one of the 3 surviving ampers immediately turned on another amper and ripped its head apart instead of pursuing the living humans in the arena. Lafleur nervously assured Genet that there were still 2 left. Genet was not amused. The third limitation was duration. The shows have not established definitively how long an amper remains in its heightened state, but the implication across multiple scenes is that the mutation is not permanent in the same way that natural variant evolution appears to be. Ampers are a forced transformation, a chemical override of the walker's baseline state, and like any chemical effect, it may diminish over time. Despite these limitations, Genet saw the ampers as the key to her military dominance of France, and the way she deployed them reveals something about the variant story that goes beyond biology and into the question of what humans do when they discover they can make the dead even more terrifying than nature already made them. The first major deployment of ampers that Daryl witnessed was in the fighting pit. Genet used gladiatorial combat as both public entertainment and political spectacle. She would bring prisoners, dissidents, or captured enemies into the pit, and then guerrillas, her soldiers, would dart walkers with the amper serum while the crowd watched. The walker would mutate in real time, its eyes going black, its veins bulging, its entire body language shifting from the shambling persistence of a standard walker to the coiled, predatory aggression of something that was actively hunting. Daryl was thrown into that pit during a pouvoir rally. A walker was led in on chains and darted with the serum while the crowd chanted pouvoir. Daryl watched the transformation happen in front of him. The walker's eyes turned black. It broke free of its restraints, and it charged. The fight between Daryl and the amper was unlike any walker combat in the history of the franchise. This was not the slow, grappling struggle of a man fending off a grabbing corpse. This was close to a fight with a living opponent. The amper was fast, it was strong. It could take punishment that would have destroyed any normal walker and keep coming. When Daryl impaled it with an axe, the thing's acidic blood burned his hands on contact, forcing him to let go of his weapon. Daryl eventually killed it by driving a French flag through its skull, using the flagpole as a makeshift spear. But the crowd's reaction, their cheering and enthusiasm, told Daryl something important about what France had become. This was not a horrified population watching a nightmare unfold. This was an audience that had been conditioned to see the weaponized dead as entertainment and as a symbol of their faction's power. Genet had turned the horror of the variant walkers into political theatre. The fighting pit escalated. After Daryl killed the first amper, he was chained to another prisoner named Quinn, and 4 more walkers were darted simultaneously. 3 mutated into ampers, 1 exploded, and then the ampers began fighting each other because the serum's uncontrollable bloodlust did not discriminate between targets. Daryl and Quinn survived by using their chain to clothesline the remaining ampers, but the scene demonstrated the central problem with Genet's weapon. It was powerful, but it was chaotic. You could create ampers, but you could not reliably aim them. Genet's ultimate escalation came in Season 2 when she prepared for a full military assault on the Nest, the mountain headquarters of the Union of Hope, a multi-faith resistance movement that opposed the pouvoir du vivant. Her plan was to convert human beings into ampers and use them as the first wave of her attack. The method was as efficient as it was monstrous. Janet gathered volunteers and selectees, people who believed they were participating in a noble cause for the power of the living. She lined them up on the tidelands near the nest, and then she had her soldiers open fire with a mounted machine gun, killing every single one of them. Before the bodies could reanimate naturally, Dr. Lafleur and his team moved in with dart guns loaded with amper serum, injecting every corpse before the standard resurrection process could begin. Carole Pelletier, who had travelled to France to find Daryl, witnessed this atrocity from within the crowd. She threw herself to the ground behind a dead man's body and played dead. A dart hit her, but she managed to pull it out before the serum could enter her system. Around her, the dead rose as ampers, their eyes black, their bodies surging with the chemical rage of Lafleur's creation. Janet then used a chained human, Stefan Codron, as a lure. Codron was dragged behind an ATV toward the nest, and the ampers followed the closest living thing, which was him. Carole hijacked the ATV and drove it through the nest's gates, leading the ampers directly into the Union of Hope's defenders. The ampers fell on the soldiers like a wave, and Jenny's guerrillas moved in behind them. It was biological warfare, the most direct, most deliberate use of variant walkers as a military weapon in the entire franchise. And yet the ampers' limitations ultimately undermined Janet's ambitions. The uncontrollable bloodlust that made them devastating against enemies also made them devastating against allies. Ampers did not distinguish between Union soldiers and pouvoir guerriers. They did not follow orders. They did not stop when the battle was won. They simply attacked anything alive until they were destroyed. Daryl himself exploited this flaw in one of the most inventive moments of the entire spin-off. Trapped in a vehicle surrounded by a standard walker herd, with Carole and an injured pilot named Ash, Daryl found 2 disassembled dart guns loaded with amper serum in a case inside the vehicle. He assembled the guns, opened the sunroof, and shot 2 walkers on the outer edges of the herd. The 2 walkers mutated into ampers, and then, consumed by their enhanced bloodlust, they tore through the rest of the herd to get to the living humans inside the vehicle. Blood splattered the windows on every side as the ampers ripped apart dozens of standard walkers. When the herd was reduced to scattered body parts, the 2 ampers broke through the vehicle's windows, and Carole and Daryl killed them both at close range. Daryl had weaponized variants against variants. He had used the amper serum's greatest flaw, its indiscriminate aggression, as a tool for his own survival. It was a perfect inversion of everything Janet had tried to build. She wanted to control the ampers. Daryl succeeded by letting them be uncontrollable. Janet herself met her end through the serum she had championed. In a confrontation at Maison Mère, Carole grabbed a dart gun and shot Janet in the back with a dose of amper serum. Janet could not pull the dart out in time. Her veins turned black. Her eyes went dark. Her head swelled from the internal pressure of the mutation, and blood burst from her as she died in one of the most graphically horrifying death scenes in the entire franchise. The woman who had weaponized the dead was killed by her own weapon, and with her death, the pouvoir du vivant's Ampère program was effectively dismantled, though the serum's formula, Lafleur's research, and the broader knowledge of how to create artificial variants remained loose in the world. In France, the variants were never just a natural phenomenon to be endured. They were a resource to be exploited, a weapon to be deployed, and ultimately, a horror that consumed the people who tried to wield it. The dead were dangerous enough on their own. Making them more dangerous on purpose was the kind of hubris that the Walking Dead universe punishes without exception. And France was not the only place where the dead had evolved beyond anything the survivors expected. Across the Atlantic, in a city that had been abandoned to the dead for years, Maggie Rhee and Negan were about to encounter something in the sewers of Manhattan that did not fit any category anyone had established. Something that was not a climber, not a burner, not an amper. Something that the isolation and decay of a drowned city had produced on its own. Manhattan was always going to be different. An island city, cut off from the mainland by water on every side, with a population density that had been among the highest in the world before the fall. When civilization collapsed and the wildfire pandemic turned the living into the dead, Manhattan became a sealed container. Millions of people died within its borders. Millions of walkers rose in their place. And unlike the rural and suburban landscapes of Georgia, Virginia, and Ohio, where the original Walking Dead took place, there was nowhere for those walkers to disperse. They filled the streets, the buildings, the subway tunnels, the sewers. They stacked against walls and piled in stairwells. They fell from rooftops when they wandered too close to edges, raining down on the streets below, in a grotesque parody of the city's old rhythm. By the time Maggie Rhee arrived in Manhattan at the beginning of the Walking Dead Dead City, the island had been abandoned by organized civilization for years. The bridges were destroyed or impassable. The surrounding waters were treacherous. No one went to Manhattan voluntarily. It was considered a dead zone in the most literal sense possible, a place where the walker population was so dense and so entrenched that reclamation was not considered feasible by any surviving community. What Maggie found when she crossed into the city was a walker ecosystem that had evolved in isolation, producing behaviours and formations that existed nowhere else in the Walking Dead universe. And the most extreme example of what isolation could produce was waiting in the sewers beneath the city streets. The Walker King was something that should not have been possible. It was a fusion. Multiple walkers, at least 4 of them, had become physically merged into a single organism over the course of years spent pressed together in the wet, confined spaces of Manhattan's sewer system. Their bodies had grown together, their decaying flesh fusing at points of contact, creating a superorganism that was larger, stronger, and more structurally complex than any individual walker could be. The comparison that the Walking Dead community most often reaches for is a rat king, a phenomenon in which a group of rats become entangled by their tails and grow together into a single, struggling mass. The Walker King was that, but with human-sized bodies and the wildfire virus binding the biological material together. The Walker King was not a variant in the same way that climbers, cohorts, burners, or ampers are variants. It was not produced by a mutation of the wildfire virus or by human experimentation with chemical serums. It was an environmental variant, a product of the specific conditions inside Manhattan sewers where closely packed walker bodies had remained in contact for so long that biological fusion occurred. The environment created something the virus alone would not have produced. Maggie encountered the Walker King in the sewers during her mission to rescue her son, Herschel, from the Croat, a former Savior lieutenant who had established himself as a warlord in Manhattan. The Walker King was massive, its multiple bodies creating a hulking presence in the tunnel, and it possessed the combined strength of all its constituent walkers. It was a lurker in the technical sense, stationary until disturbed, but the scale of it was something entirely new. Maggie ultimately destroyed it, because even fused walkers still die when you destroy their brains. But the encounter demonstrated something important about the variant story that goes beyond specific types and categories. The dead were not just mutating through viral evolution or human experimentation. They were being shaped by their environments. Given enough time and the right conditions, the wildfire virus could produce things that nobody had predicted because nobody had imagined the conditions that would create them. Manhattan's walker ecology went well beyond the sewers. The surface of the city presented its own unique horrors. Walkers fell from buildings, as mentioned. They had wandered upper floors and rooftops for years, and when sound or movement drew them toward an edge, they simply walked off. Maggie, Negan, and their reluctant guide Jano experienced this firsthand while moving through the city streets, dodging walkers that shattered on impact with vehicles and and pavement below them. It was raining dead, a uniquely Manhattan phenomenon that no other location in the franchise had produced, because no other location had the vertical architecture combined with the walker density to make it possible. The gangs that controlled different sections of Manhattan had adapted to this environment in ways that further demonstrated how variance and unusual walker behavior reshape human society. The Croat, operating from a fortified base with his Barazi soldiers, used walkers as tools, as territorial markers, and as gladiatorial entertainment. He and later the Dharma, a more politically sophisticated leader who assumed control after the Croats' role evolved, maintained arenas where walkers were pitted against each other in organized fights. The walkers were armored with spiked gear, metal plates bolted to their bodies, creating makeshift gladiators that the crowd bet on and cheered for. Bruegel, the leader of another Manhattan faction, kept a personal walker that he fed live rats. He maintained the walker as something between a pet and a weapon, feeding it to keep it active and aggressive, storing it behind a covered drape in his quarters. The casual way Bruegel interacted with this walker, tossing a rat into a bucket and kicking it across the room toward the hidden corpse, illustrated how profoundly the relationship between the living and the dead had warped in a place like Manhattan. The dead were not just a threat to be managed, they were a resource, a form of currency, entertainment, and power. The New Babylon Federation, the organized government that controlled territory outside Manhattan, viewed the island's walker population as both an obstacle and a strategic consideration. Manhattan's infrastructure, particularly its methane reserves and its underground power grid, represented resources worth controlling. The power grid, as one character noted, had been run underground since the blizzard of 1888, meaning it had likely survived the destruction of the surface city. If someone could clear enough of the walker population to access that infrastructure, they could potentially restore power to parts of the city. That possibility made Manhattan worth fighting over, despite the horror of what it contained. The dynamic in Dead City between the living factions competing for control of Manhattan while the dead occupied every corner of it created something that did not exist elsewhere in the franchise. In the original show, in the Commonwealth, even in France, the living had established zones of control where walkers were kept out or managed. Manhattan had no such zones. The dead owned the city. Every living person inside it was an intruder, moving through territory that belonged to the walkers and could not be reclaimed without a level of force and organization that no single faction possessed. Dead City also introduced another element to the variant story that is worth noting, because it connects to the broader theme of environmental mutation. The walkers inside the buildings of Manhattan had been confined in enclosed spaces for years. Some had not moved in that entire time, becoming lurkers of an extreme and entrenched variety. Others had been exposed to unique environmental conditions: the sewage, the decay of the buildings themselves, the flooding, the chemical contamination from countless burst pipes and leaking containers. Manhattan was an uncontrolled experiment in what happens to the wildfire virus when its hosts are subjected to conditions that no natural landscape would produce. The Walker King was the most visible result of that experiment, but it was not the only one. The walkers that fell from buildings had fractured and reformed in ways that produced unusual body configurations. Some had lost limbs and continued functioning. Others had embedded objects, pieces of rebar, broken glass, fragments of furniture, into their bodies as they decayed in contact with the debris of civilization. These were not variants in the viral sense. They were variants in the environmental sense, products of a specific, unrepeatable set of conditions that only a dense urban environment left to rot for over a decade could create. The Croat himself represented another dimension of how variants reshape human behavior. He had been a savior, one of Negan's soldiers during the war against Rick's communities years earlier. He had learned from Negan how to use fear as a tool of control, and in Manhattan, surrounded by a walker population more dense and more dangerous than anything he had experienced in Virginia. The Croat refined that lesson. He used walkers as instruments of torture, as execution methods, as psychological weapons against rival factions and captives alike. His treatment of Maggie's son Herschel, his manipulation of other characters through the implicit threat of walker exposure, all of it was built on an understanding that in a place like Manhattan, the dead were not just a threat, they were leverage. Negan returning to Manhattan in Season 2 under vastly different circumstances, working with the Dharma and the Croat in a complex arrangement that involved protecting his wife, Annie, and their son Joshua, found himself in the middle of a power struggle where walkers were treated as both weapon and commodity. The gladiatorial matches he attended, the territorial disputes he mediated, the Dharma's strategic calculations about walker-controlled zones, all of it treated the dead as a permanent feature of the political landscape, rather than a problem to be solved. And that might be the most significant thing Manhattan contributed to the variant story. Not a new type of walker, not a new mutation or a new serum, but a new way of thinking about what the dead are. In the original show, walkers were an enemy to be defeated. In France, they were a weapon to be wielded. In Manhattan, they were an ecosystem to be navigated. The living did not hope to eliminate the dead from the island. They hoped to carve out enough space among them to survive, to trade, to fight each other over resources, and to build something that might last. The dead were the environment. The variants and the environmental mutations were the weather. And the living were just tenants, renting space in a city that the dead had owned for years. Manhattan proved that isolation does not make walkers less dangerous. It makes them stranger, it makes them less predictable, and it creates conditions for biological phenomena like the Walker King that would not occur in any other environment. The variant story is not just about viral mutations and chemical serums. It is about what happens when billions of reanimated bodies interact with every possible environment on Earth over the course of years and decades. The virus adapts, the dead change, and the living have to change with them or be consumed. Maggie survived Manhattan, Negan survived Manhattan, Herschel was recovered, but the city itself remained what it had always been since the fall, a sealed container full of the dead, evolving slowly in the dark, producing things that the world outside had never seen and was not prepared for. And if General Beale's assessment was correct, if the walkers truly were evolving toward a future that humanity could not survive, then Manhattan was a preview, a contained demonstration of what happens when the dead are given enough time and the right conditions to become something worse. There is a version of this story where the variant walkers are the scariest thing in the Walking Dead universe. Climbers scaling walls, burners dissolving flesh on contact, ampers charging with black eyes and acidic blood. The Walker King fused together in the sewers of Manhattan. Each of these is terrifying on its own terms, and each of them represents an escalation of the threat that the dead pose to the living. But the single most frightening piece of information about variant walkers in the entire franchise does not come from a fight scene, or a jump scare, or a dramatic reveal. It comes from a briefing room inside the Civic Republic of Philadelphia, delivered in calm, measured, military language by a man who had spent years studying the data and had reached a conclusion that he believed was not a matter of opinion, but of mathematical certainty. General Jonathan Beale, the commander of the Civic Republic military, told Rick Grimes during the classified echelon briefing that walker-borne disease would eventually cause the extinction of the human race. Not might. Would. Beale did not present this as a worst-case scenario or a possibility to be guarded against. He presented it as an inevitability that could only be delayed, not prevented, and only then if the Civic Republic took drastic and morally catastrophic action to ensure its own survival as the last viable concentration of humanity on the continent. To understand what the echelon briefing means for the variant walker story, you need to understand what the CRM was, how it operated, and what Rick Grimes discovered during the years he spent inside it after being taken from the bridge explosion that his family and friends believed had killed him. The Civic Republic of Philadelphia was the largest known surviving population center in the Walking Dead universe. It was a city of hundreds of thousands of people, governed by a civilian council, protected by the CRM, and connected to two alliance communities, the campus colony near Omaha and Portland. The city itself was functional in ways that would seem almost miraculous to anyone who had survived the apocalypse in the outside world. It had infrastructure, it had electricity, it had government, commerce, education, agriculture. It had something that resembled a normal civilian life, protected by walls and by a military force that operated with a level of discipline and resources that dwarfed anything the Commonwealth or Alexandria or any other community had ever achieved. But the CRM was not just a defensive military protecting a civilian city. It was a shadow state within a state. It operated outside civilian oversight. It maintained classified programs. It conducted operations that the civilian council knew nothing about. And its assessment of the long-term survival prospects of humanity was profoundly pessimistic in ways that drove it to commit atrocities on a scale that makes the governor and Negan look like minor threats by comparison. Rick Grimes had been brought to the Civic Republic by Jadis, the former leader of the scavengers at the heaps near Alexandria. Jadis had found Rick half dead on the riverbank here after the bridge explosion and had delivered him to the CRM as an asset. Rick was designated a consignee, a person brought in from outside who worked off a period of indentured service before being allowed to move freely within the city. He spent years in this status, trying to escape, trying to get home to his family, and failing repeatedly. He eventually lost contact with his own dreams of his children. He could not picture Carl's face anymore. He could not picture Michonne's. The CRM had not just taken his freedom. Over time, it had taken his ability to imagine a life outside its walls. When Michonne arrived at the Civic Republic years later, having tracked Rick across the country and eventually found him during a CRM operation, the two of them began the process of uncovering what the CRM actually was and what it was planning to do. And what they discovered was far worse than anything either of them had imagined. The CRM had destroyed Omaha, not lost it to walkers, not failed to protect it, destroyed it deliberately. Along with its campus colony, home to tens of thousands of people, the CRM had gassed the populations and eliminated them because Beale's strategic assessment had concluded that the Civic Republic could not sustain its alliance partners in the long term. The resources those communities consumed were resources the Civic Republic would need for its own survival. In Beale's calculus, those people were already dead. They just did not know it yet. Killing them quickly and cleanly was in the CRM's framing an act of mercy compared to the slow extinction that awaited everyone who was not inside the Civic Republic's walls. And Omaha was not the end. The CRM was planning to destroy Portland as well. The attack on Portland was scheduled, planned in detail, and briefed to senior CRM officers during the echelon briefing that Rick attended. Children would be airlifted from 3 school sites before the gassing began, evacuating approximately 10% of the youth population. The rest, the adults, the elderly, the children they could not reach in time, would die. And then the CRM would declare martial law on the Civic Republic itself, dissolving the civilian council and placing the city under full military control. With its alliance partners dead and its own civilian government removed, the CRM would then march across the continent, eliminating any growing competition, taking their resources, and ensuring that the Civic Republic remained the supreme force in the hemisphere and possibly the world. This was the plan. This was what the CRM had decided was necessary. And the justification for all of it, every gassed community, every murdered civilian, Every violation of the principles the civic republic claimed to represent came back to one assessment. The walkers were evolving. Disease carried by the billions of reanimated bodies covering the Earth was going to mutate into something that would finish what the original pandemic started. Humanity's extinction was not a question of if, it was a question of when, and the only variable the CRM believed it could control was whether the civic republic survived long enough to outlast the threat. Beale described the walkers in language that connected directly to everything the variant story had been building across the franchise. He called them a billion petri dishes stumbling and cooking in the sun, waiting to transmit God knows what to us, while it transforms into God knows what. That description is important because it articulates the mechanism by which variants are produced. The wildfire virus does not exist in isolation inside each walker. It interacts with other pathogens. It reacts to environmental conditions. It mutates in response to stimuli that no one is monitoring because no one has the resources to monitor the biological activity of billions of reanimated corpses spread across every continent on Earth. The prison flu in Season 4 had been a small-scale demonstration of this, a swine flu variant passing through walker bodies, picking up characteristics from the wildfire virus, producing walkers with new symptoms and heightened aggression. Beale's briefing suggested that this process was not an anomaly. It was ongoing, it was accelerating, and the eventual product of that acceleration would be a pathogen or a set of pathogens that the human immune system simply could not survive. The variant walkers that had already appeared, the climbers, the cohorts, the burners, all of these were, in Beale's framework, early warning signs. Not the final threat itself, but indicators of the virus's capacity to produce new forms. Each new variant demonstrated that the wildfire virus was not static. It was learning in the evolutionary sense. It was selecting for traits that made its hosts more dangerous, more durable, and more capable of spreading infection. The logical endpoint of that selection process, given enough time and enough bodies, was a form of the dead that the living could not defend against. Rick was horrified by the echelon briefing, not because he doubted the science. Beale's data was compelling, and Rick had seen enough of the variant threat firsthand to know that the walkers were changing. What horrified him was the CRM's response to that data. Genocide as strategy, extinction prevention through mass murder. The CRM had looked at the honest, terrifying reality of the variant threat and concluded that the only solution was to eliminate everyone who was not inside their walls before the walkers did it for them. Rick and Michonne chose a different path. Together, they exposed the CRM's plans, worked to bring down the military's command structure from within, and ultimately killed Beale to prevent the attack on Portland. They destroyed Jadis's dossier, the file that would have led the CRM to Alexandria and everyone they loved. They took the information about the CRM's operations, including the echelon briefing, and committed to bringing it to the Civic Republic civilian population, trusting that the city's own people would reject the military's genocidal approach when confronted with the truth. But Rick and Michonne's victory, as significant as it was, did not resolve the underlying problem that Beale had identified. They stopped the CRM from murdering Portland. They broke the military's grip on the Civic Republic. They went home. But the walkers did not stop evolving because a general was killed and a military conspiracy was exposed. The variant threat exists independently of any human institution. It is a biological process driven by the interactions between the wildfire virus, its billions of hosts, and the planetary environment. It does not care about political structures or military strategies or the moral choices of individual human beings. It simply continues. Mutation after mutation, variant after variant, each one slightly different, slightly more adapted, slightly more dangerous. The ones who live focused more on the CRM conspiracy than on variant walkers specifically. Rick encountered walkers during his time with the CRM, but the show's primary concern was with the human dimension of the threat. The political structures, the moral compromises, the personal cost of Rick's separation from his family, and his gradual loss of himself inside the CRM's machinery. The variant walkers were the context, the background radiation that explained why the CRM had become what it became. But they were not the show's central focus. What the ones who live contributed to the variant story was context. It explained why the CRM behaved the way it did. It connected Beale's extinction assessment to the variant phenomena that viewers had been watching unfold across multiple shows. It established that the most powerful and best-informed group of humans in the Walking Dead universe had looked at the variant data and concluded that humanity was running out of time. Whether that conclusion was correct or whether it was the paranoid overreach of a military that had been given too much power and too little oversight is something the franchise has not resolved. But the assessment exists, the data behind it exists, and the variants keep appearing. Rick and Michonne went home to their children, to Judith and RJ, and the community they had been separated from for years. They carried with them the knowledge of what the CRM had done and what the CRM had feared. They carried the echelon briefing's warning about the extinction clock and the evolving threat of the dead. And they carried the unresolved question that hangs over the entire variant Walker story, the question that no character in the franchise has been able to answer. Is Beale right? Is the trajectory of Walker evolution genuinely heading toward human extinction? Or is it possible that the same virus that keeps producing more dangerous variants might also produce something that could be used against it? The French tried to neutralize the virus and created worse variants instead. The CRM studied the virus and concluded that the only response was consolidation and genocide. Neither approach worked. Neither approach addressed the fundamental problem, which is that the wildfire virus is embedded in every living human being on Earth, activating upon death, and the variants it produces in its reanimated hosts are shaped by forces that no one fully understands or controls. The variant walkers are not just a physical threat, they are an existential one, and the Walking Dead universe, across all its shows and all its spin-offs, has not yet produced a character, a community, or an institution that has figured out how to stop what the French started in that laboratory all those years ago. The dead keep changing, the living keep adapting, and the distance between those two processes is the distance between survival and extinction. So now we know the full story. From the first moment Rick Grimes opened his eyes in that hospital in King County, Georgia, to the last moments of the CRM's exposure by Rick and Michonne in Philadelphia. From a little girl holding a teddy bear in a gas station parking lot to a French scientist sprinting at a metal door 30 seconds after being shot in the back. From the quiet turning of a doorknob by Morgan's dead wife to the black-eyed fury of an amper tearing through a herd in the French countryside. The variant Walker story spans the entire Walking Dead universe. It touches every show, every spin-off, every community, and every character who has ever survived in this world. And now, having walked through all of it, it is worth laying out the complete timeline, start to finish, because seeing it all in sequence reveals something that watching the shows in their broadcast order does not fully convey: the scope, the escalation, the slow, relentless progression of a threat that was present from the very first frame of the very first episode, hidden in plain sight for over a decade. The wildfire virus was created at Ella Biomedicine, DDMI, a biomedical research laboratory in France. 2 research teams operated at the facility, the Primrose team and the Violet team. The exact nature of their original research has not been fully revealed, but the outcome is not in dispute. They created a pathogen that, once released, would reanimate the dead and end human civilization. The virus was discovered by the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta on April 16, 2010. Dr. Edwin Jenner, the virologist who would become the last surviving scientist at the CDC began documenting its effects and communicating with the French lab to share data. The French were doing the same. Both sides were trying to understand what they were dealing with. Both sides were failing. Cases were initially scarce. Media outlets reported on isolated incidents of extreme aggression and apparent cannibalism, as well as scattered reports of dead bodies reanimating. Many people dismissed these stories as sensationalist fabrication. The virus spread faster than the information about it. On August 25th, 2010, the CDC declared wildfire a global pandemic. 2 days later, on August 27th, the virus reached what the franchise describes as cataclysmic levels. The standard mortality rate, meaning people who died of natural causes, injuries, and existing illnesses, reanimated and attacked the living. The cascade was instantaneous and global. Hospitals became slaughterhouses. Military cordons were overwhelmed. Governments dissolved. The infrastructure of modern civilization, power grids, water systems, communication networks, supply chains, all of it failed in a matter of days. This was the fall, the end of the world as it had existed. And from the ashes of that collapse, the survivors emerged into a landscape dominated by the dead. In the early days, roughly 2010 through 2011, the walkers in America displayed a range of behaviours that would later be classified as variant traits. Rick Grimes, who emerged from a coma at Harrison Memorial Hospital in King County, Georgia, an unspecified number of weeks after the fall, encountered several of these early variants without understanding what they were. The little girl at the gas station, later identified by the fandom as Summer, picked up a stuffed animal from beneath a car and carried it. This demonstrated object recognition and fine motor coordination. Morgan Jones's wife, Jenny, repeatedly returned to the house where she had died, turned the doorknob, and looked through the peephole. This demonstrated spatial memory, basic tool manipulation, and what appeared to be recognition of her former home. During the siege at the department store in Atlanta, a walker picked up a large rock and used it to smash the glass doors. This demonstrated tool use and problem solving. These behaviours were real. They were written intentionally, and they were confirmed more than a decade later by showrunner Angela Kang and franchise overseer Scott Gimple as genuine variant behaviour that had existed since the very beginning of the show. The early walkers were not all the same. Some of them retained fragments of their former cognitive abilities. Some of them were faster, stronger, or more coordinated than others. But these variants were rare, and they were regional. Not every survivor encountered them. And as the show standardized its walker behavior from season 2 onward, under new showrunners, the smarter walkers disappeared from the narrative for years. They were written off by fans as early season inconsistencies. They were, in fact, the first evidence of something that would reshape the entire franchise. During the years covered by seasons 2 through 10, roughly 2011 through 2021, in the show's internal timeline, the walker threat in America appeared stable. The dead were slow, predictable, and manageable for any group that maintained basic security protocols. The real threats during this period were human. The governor waged war on the prison community. The people of Terminus hunted and consumed other survivors. The wolves attacked Alexandria with suicidal fury. Negan and the Saviors dominated through systematic brutality. The Whisperers used walker herds as territorial weapons, culminating in the massacre at the fair, where Alpha mounted the heads of murdered community members on stakes. Throughout all of this, the walkers themselves remained background radiation. Dangerous in herds easily handled individually, the survivors built walls, established trade routes, developed agricultural systems, and created something that looked, however imperfectly, like a sustainable post-apocalyptic civilization. They believed they had solved the walker problem. They had not. In Season 4, during the prison arc, the swine flu outbreak provided an early warning that nobody heeded. A disease passed through the walker population and into the living community, killing Patrick and several others before being contained. The walkers produced by this illness had bleeding eyes and exhibited heightened aggression. The prison's doctor identified the illness as similar to a pre-pandemic swine flu transmitted by the pigs Rick had been raising. Herschel, Green and Bob Stuckey helped manage the crisis, but the underlying lesson that walkers were disease vectors capable of carrying and mutating pathogens in ways that could devastate human communities was not absorbed by the survivors in any lasting way. They buried their dead, mourned their losses, and moved on. General Beale's echelon briefing would later frame this exact dynamic as the core mechanism behind humanity's potential extinction. The prison flu was a contained preview. Beale's fear was that the uncontained version was only a matter of time. Meanwhile, in France, the Violet team at LR Biomedicine DDMI had attempted to end the walker threat through a direct biological intervention. Their cardiac plaque experiments were designed to prevent reanimation by short-circuiting the process that allowed the wildfire virus to restart the brainstem after death. Instead, the experiments produced an adverse variant strain that dramatically reduced resurrection time and increased the speed, strength, aggression, and intelligence of the reanimated dead. This variant escaped the lab, likely through the reanimation of researchers or subjects who had been exposed and spread across Europe. The variant strain transformed the walker landscape of the European continent. France, where the experiments had originated, was particularly affected. Walkers there could run, they could climb. Some had acidic blood and skin, the burner variant, that made physical contact with them as dangerous as being bitten. The French survivors, trapped on a continent with these enhanced dead, developed entirely different survival strategies than their American counterparts. While Americans built walls and relied on the walkers' predictable slowness, the French had to contend with dead that could outpace, outclimb, and chemically burn anyone who tried to fight them at close range. The pouvoir de vivant, Genet's nationalist paramilitary movement, rose to power partly because it promised to turn the variant threat into an advantage. Using Dr. Lafleur's AMPA serum, Genet created artificially enhanced superwalkers as weapons of war. The AMPAs were the most extreme variant in the franchise, possessing enhanced speed, strength, durability, acidic blood, and a level of aggression that made them attack anything alive, including each other. Genet deployed them as shock troops against the Union of Hope, using mass execution followed by immediate serum injection to create instant armies of the enhanced dead. The AMPA serum program was ultimately destroyed along with Janet herself, who died when Carol shot her with a dart loaded with the serum. But the knowledge of how to create AMPAs, Dr. Lafleur's research and methodology, exists somewhere in the world. The franchise has not confirmed that this knowledge was permanently lost. In America, the variant walkers arrived in force during the final season of the original Walking Dead. Season 11, Episode 19, titled Variant, introduced the Climber variant through Aaron's encounter at the fairground, a walker that could open gates, climb walls, turn doorknobs, use tools, and pick up rocks as weapons. Aaron's group survived the encounter, but were fundamentally shaken by it. Aaron warned his companions afterward to stay alert because they did not know whether the climber was a one-time encounter or an indication of a broader change. It was not a one-time encounter. During the series finale, climber variants scaled the walls of the Commonwealth, the largest and most heavily defended community in the American Walking Dead. A climber killed Trooper Livitz on top of the wall and accidentally triggered the gate controls, allowing an entire herd to flood the community. Another variant used a brick to smash reinforced glass at the hospital. The Commonwealth's military, led by General Mercer, determined that the variants were too dangerous to be managed with traditional herding techniques, and instead chose to trap and destroy the herd using explosives and fuel, a scorched earth response that reflected the qualitative change in the threat level. On Manhattan Island, isolation and environmental conditions produced the Walker King, a fusion of multiple walkers that had grown together in the sewer system into a single superorganism. The surface streets of the city presented their own unique phenomena, including walkers falling from buildings and gangs using walkers as gladiatorial entertainment, territorial control mechanisms, and instruments of political power. Dead City demonstrated that the variant story extends beyond viral mutations and chemical serums into environmental adaptation, where the specific conditions of a given location shape the dead into forms that would not occur naturally elsewhere. The ones who live revealed that the Civic Republic military had been studying variant evolution for years and had reached the conclusion that walker-borne disease would cause human extinction. General Beale's echelon briefing described the walkers as an evolving biological threat on a planetary scale, and the CRM's response, which included the deliberate destruction of allied communities and the planned genocide of Portland, was driven by this assessment. Rick and Michonne exposed and dismantled the CRM's command structure, but the underlying threat that Beale had identified, the ongoing evolution of the wildfire virus within billions of reanimated hosts, remains unresolved. That is the complete timeline, from a French laboratory to a Georgia gas station, to the walls of the Commonwealth, to the fighting pits of France, to the sewers of Manhattan, to the briefing rooms of the Civic Republic. Every variant, every mutation, every evolution of the dead, connected by a single thread that runs from the very first episode to the most recent. And there are questions that remain open, questions that the franchise has raised through its various shows and spin-offs, but has not yet answered. What happened to the Primrose team? They were at a conference in Toledo, Ohio, when the wildfire pandemic reached its cataclysmic phase. They never returned to France. The vigilante at Ella Biomedicine DDMI vowed to kill them if they ever came back. But did they survive in America? Are they alive somewhere in the Walking Dead universe? They were the researchers who created the wildfire virus. They understood it better than anyone. If anyone could develop a true cure or a way to neutralize the variant strains, it would be them. Toledo is in Ohio. The Commonwealth is in Ohio. The climate variants appeared in the Ohio region. These geographic overlaps may not be coincidental. Are the variants spreading from Europe to America? The climber that Aaron encountered in Virginia appeared more than a decade after the fall. If the variant strain had been present in America from the beginning, introduced by the Primrose team's presence in Ohio, why did it take so long to become visible? One possibility is that the variant strain was always present in low concentrations, rare enough to be dismissed as anomalies or whisperer activity, and has only recently reached a population density where encounters are becoming more frequent. Another possibility is that the variant strain is spreading geographically, moving across the continent the way the original virus did, transforming standard walkers into enhanced versions as it goes. Has the Ampere serum been permanently lost? Janet is dead. Dr. Lafleur's fate after Season 2 of Daryl Dixon is not entirely clear in terms of whether he retained the knowledge and ability to recreate the serum. The formula, or at least the methodology behind it, existed in Lafleur's laboratory at Maison Mère. If anyone recovered those notes, the ability to create artificially enhanced superwalkers could be reproduced anywhere in the world. The serum is arguably the most dangerous piece of technology in the entire Walking Dead universe, because unlike nuclear weapons or conventional military hardware, it requires only basic laboratory equipment and a supply of dead bodies, both of which are essentially unlimited in the post-apocalyptic world. What happened to the CRM's research files on variants? Rick and Michonne exposed the CRM's military conspiracy and killed Beale, but the Civic Republic itself, with its population of hundreds of thousands, its infrastructure and its scientific institutions, presumably survived. The research that Beale based his extinction assessment on exists somewhere in the Civic Republic's archives. If that research were to fall into the wrong hands, or if the Civic Republic scientists were to continue the work under different leadership, the results could range from a genuine breakthrough in understanding the variant threat to a repetition of the French lab's catastrophic mistake. Is Beale's extinction prediction correct? This is the largest unresolved question in the entire franchise. The CRM's assessment was based on data about the virus's evolution, the growing diversity of variant types, and the potential for Walker-borne disease to produce pathogens that the human immune system could not handle. No other group in the Walking Dead universe has access to the same level of data or analytical capability. The survivors in Alexandria, the Hilltop, the Commonwealth, and other communities are dealing with the variants tactically, encountering them one by one and adapting their combat methods accordingly. They do not have the big picture view that Beale had. They do not know what the CRM knew. They are fighting individual battles against an enemy whose long-term trajectory they cannot see, and that is perhaps the most unsettling thing about the variant Walker story as it stands. The threat is not just physical, it is informational. The survivors do not know what they are facing. They know that some walkers are faster. They know that some walkers can climb. They know that some walkers have acidic blood. They know that artificial enhancement is possible. But they do not know why the variants are appearing, how the virus is evolving, or what the endpoint of that evolution might be. They are reacting to symptoms without understanding the disease. The Walking Dead universe began with a man waking up in a hospital and discovering that the world had ended while he was unconscious. Rick Grimes walked out of Harrison Memorial Hospital into a landscape of the dead, carrying nothing but confusion and the desperate desire to find his family. The first walker he saw was lying on the ground outside, a woman with no legs, reaching for him with a kind of desperate futility that he would never forget. He did not know what she was. He did not know what had happened. He did not know that the virus was inside him too, waiting for the moment of his death to restart his brainstem and turn him into one of them. Everything that has happened since, every battle, every community, every loss and every victory has taken place inside a world defined by the wildfire virus and the dead it produces. And what the variant story reveals, laid out end to end from the French laboratory to the present, is that the world was never as stable as anyone believed. The dead were always changing. The virus was always mutating. The variants were always there in the background, waiting for the conditions that would bring them into the foreground. The French tried to stop the virus and made it worse. The CRM tried to manage the threat and became monsters in the process. Janet tried to weaponize the dead and was killed by her own weapon. Manhattan tried to coexist with the dead and became a cage. Every approach to the variant problem has failed or has produced consequences as dangerous as the problem itself. And the dead keep walking. The variants keep appearing. In France, in America, in Manhattan, in whatever other corners of the world the franchise has not yet explored. The wildfire virus is doing what viruses do. It is evolving. It is adapting. It is producing new forms of itself that are better suited to the world it inhabits. And the world it inhabits is the entire planet, populated by billions of reanimated hosts, each one a vector for the next mutation, the next variant, the next escalation in a biological arms race that the living did not start and do not know how to win. Rick Grimes woke up in a hospital 13 years ago and walked into a world of the dead. The first walker he ever killed was holding a teddy bear. The most recent variants can climb walls, dissolve flesh on contact, charge with enhanced speed and strength, and resist damage that would destroy any normal walker. The distance between that little girl and those ampers is the distance the virus has travelled in just over a decade. And if Beale was right, it is not done travelling. The dead were never simple. They were never predictable. They were never fully understood. From the very first episode to the most recent, the Walking Dead universe has been telling a single story about what happens when humanity shares a planet with a virus it cannot control and a threat it cannot fully comprehend. The variant walkers are the latest chapter in that story. They are almost certainly not the last. The world of the Walking Dead keeps turning, the dead keep changing, and somewhere out there, in a lab, or a sewer, or a forest, or a city that has been left to rot, the next variant is already forming. Not because anyone designed it, not because anyone wanted it, simply because the virus does what it has always done since the day it escaped that French laboratory and ended the world. It adapts, it evolves, it survives, and it does not stop. There is one more piece of the variant story that deserves attention before we close, because it comes from a corner of the franchise that many viewers overlooked entirely, and it contains one of the most fascinating observations about walker behaviour in the entire universe. Tales of the Walking Dead was an anthology series that aired on AMC in 2022. Each episode told a standalone story set in the Walking Dead universe, featuring new characters in situations disconnected from the main show's ongoing narrative. One of those episodes featured a naturalist named Dr. Chauncey Everett, played by Anthony Edwards, who had dedicated his post-apocalypse life to studying walkers in the wild. Not fighting them, not avoiding them, studying them the way a biologist in the old world might have studied wolf packs or migratory birds. Everett operated in something called the Dead Sector, a massive man-made trench spanning hundreds of miles between Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. The trench was approximately 40 feet deep and 200 meters wide, and it functioned as a continental barrier, channeling walker migration patterns along predictable routes. Everett used the Dead Sector as his field laboratory, observing walker behavior from positions of relative safety above the trench, documenting everything he saw with the meticulous discipline of a man who believed that understanding the dead was more important than simply killing them. One of his subjects was a walker he designated Specimen 21. In life, Specimen 21 had been Dr. Mosley, a colleague of Everett's. In death, Specimen 21 had become something that defied the standard understanding of what walkers were. Everett observed Specimen 21 kill a wild dog, which was not unusual for a walker. Walkers attack and consume living things. That is baseline behaviour. What was unusual, what stopped Everett in his tracks and prompted him to document it with particular care, was what Specimen 21 did after killing the dog. It did not eat it, it left the carcass behind for the trailing herd. Everett described this in his notes as a selfless display of generosity. He said that Specimen 21 was instinctively a protector, making sure the rest of the herd was taken care of. That language, selfless, protector, generosity, is striking because it attributes qualities to a walker that the franchise's established science says should be impossible. The wildfire virus restarts only the brainstem. Higher functions are gone. Empathy, altruism, social awareness. These are not brainstem activities. They require cortical involvement that should be completely dead, and yet Specimen 21 killed prey and left it for others. Not randomly, not because it lost interest, deliberately, in a pattern that Everett observed more than once. The behaviour was atypical of walkers, which is exactly the language of variant classification. Specimen 21 was exhibiting variant behaviour, a form of social intelligence that no other walker in the franchise had been documented displaying. It was not climbing walls or burning flesh or charging with enhanced speed. It was making decisions about resource distribution within its herd. It was, in some rudimentary way that should not have been possible, leading. Everett's work in the Dead Sector represents the only sustained scientific observation of walker behaviour in the wild that the franchise has depicted outside of laboratory settings. The CRM studied walkers in captivity, in controlled experiments. The French studied them through viral manipulation. Everett studied them the way Darwin studied finches, by watching them in their natural environment and documenting what he saw without trying to change it. What he saw suggested that the variant story is even broader and more complex than the specific types that the franchise has formally classified. Climbers, cohorts, burners, ampers, these are the dramatic variants, the ones that change combat dynamics and threaten communities. But Everett's observations suggest that subtler variants exist as well. Walkers that display social behaviour, walkers that exhibit what appears to be decision-making about food resources, walkers that may, in some limited and deeply degraded way, retain fragments of the personalities they had in life. This connects back to the very first episode of the original show, to Morgan's wife, Jenny, turning the doorknob of her former home every night. Jenny was not a climber, she was not a cohort, she was a standard roamer with one exceptional quality. She remembered where she had lived, and she tried to go home. Specimen 21 was not a climber or a cohort either. It was a standard walker within a herd that exhibited one exceptional quality. It shared food with its group instead of consuming it alone. These are not the variants that breach walls or dissolve flesh. These are the variants that suggest something even more unsettling about the wildfire virus and its long-term trajectory. The virus is not just making walkers faster and stronger. In some cases, in rare and poorly understood ways, it appears to be restoring fragments of cognitive function that should have been permanently destroyed. Not enough to make the walkers human again, not enough to make them conscious or aware in any meaningful way, but enough to produce behaviours that look, from the outside, like memory, like social bonding, like the faintest shadow of the person the walker used to be. If Beale's assessment is correct, that the virus is continuously evolving, then these subtle variants may be as important as the dramatic ones. A walker that can climb a wall is a tactical problem. A walker that can coordinate with other walkers, that can share resources, that can exhibit anything resembling pack behaviour with intentional hierarchy, that is a strategic problem of an entirely different magnitude. Herds in The Walking Dead have always been treated as mindless aggregations, groups of walkers moving together because they're drawn to the same stimuli. If some walkers within those herds are beginning to display social coordination, then herds become something closer to organised groups. And organised groups of the dead, however primitive their organisation might be, would represent a threat that no wall, no weapon, and no strategy currently in use would be designed to handle. The variant walker story is, at its core, a story about the limits of understanding. Every character in the Walking Dead universe who has encountered variants has been forced to confront the same realization. What they thought they knew about the dead was incomplete. The rules they had built their survival around were based on observations of a threat that was already changing beneath their feet. The walls were never as safe as they seemed. The routines were never as reliable as they felt. The dead were never as simple as anyone needed them to be. And this, perhaps, is why the variant story resonates so deeply within the franchise. The Walking Dead has always been about adaptation, about the gap between how the world is and how we need it to be, about the cost of survival and the things you lose along the way. The variant walkers are the latest expression of that theme, and in some ways the most honest, because the variants tell the survivors and the audience something that no one wants to hear. You cannot master a threat that will not stay the same. You cannot build permanent safety in a world where the danger is evolving faster than your defenses. You cannot stop fighting because you won the last fight, because the next fight will be against something you have never seen before. The variant walkers are the universe's way of saying that the apocalypse is not a single event that happens and then stabilizes into a new normal. It is an ongoing process, a continuous unfolding of consequences from a single catastrophic mistake made in a French laboratory before most of the current survivors were old enough to understand what was happening. The wildfire virus escaped, the dead rose, the world fell, and the dead kept changing. They changed when the Violet team tried to stop them and made them worse. They changed when Janet pumped them full of chemicals and turned them into weapons. They changed when they were sealed inside Manhattan sewers for a decade and fused together into something that should not exist. They changed in the forests of Georgia, where a little girl picked up a teddy bear, and in the streets of King County, where a dead woman came home every night. They changed in the dead sector, where a walker killed a dog and left it for its herd. They changed at the Commonwealth, where they climbed the walls that were supposed to keep them out forever. They are still changing. Somewhere in the Walking Dead universe, right now, as the survivors rebuild and regroup and try to construct something worth living for out of the wreckage of the old world, the wildfire virus is doing what it has always done. Mutating inside its billions of hosts, interacting with new pathogens, responding to new environments, producing new variants that no one has encountered yet and that no one is prepared for. Rick Grimes is home with his family. Daryl Dixon is back from France with Carol and Laurent. Maggie Rhee has her son. Negan is somewhere, doing whatever Negan does when the fighting stops. The Commonwealth is rebuilding. The Civic Republic is restructuring after the fall of the CRM's command structure. Across what remains of the world, the living are trying to live, and the dead are walking, the same as they have been since the beginning. Slow, most of them. Predictable, most of them. Manageable, most of them, but not all. And that is the whole story. That is the complete history of variant walkers in the Walking Dead universe, from origin to evolution, to weaponization, to the present day. A story that started in a laboratory in France and spread across the entire globe. A story about a virus that will not stop changing, and a species that cannot afford to stop adapting. One of the details that makes the variant story feel so real, so grounded in something that goes beyond typical zombie fiction, is the physical differences between the types. The franchise was careful about this. Standard walkers, the roamers and lurkers that make up the vast majority of the dead, have irises and pupils clouded by a greyish-blue or greenish-amber haze. Their eyes look dead because they are dead. There is nothing behind them except the brainstem's minimal electrical activity, keeping the body moving. Climber variants retain their pupils. Their irises are still clouded, but the visible pupil gives them a more focused appearance. When you look at a climber, and several characters have made this observation across the franchise, it feels like something is looking back. Not a person, not a mind in any meaningful sense, but an awareness, a presence behind the eyes that standard walkers completely lack. Aaron described this feeling after his encounter at the fairground. The sense that the walker he was fighting was not just grabbing at him the way walkers always grab. It was watching him. It was reacting to what he did. It was adapting in real time. Amper eyes are entirely different. When the serum takes effect, the walker's eyes turn completely black. The iris and pupil and white, all swallowed by a flat, lightless darkness that covers the entire visible surface of the eye. Combined with the protruding, dark veins that spread across the skin and the acidic blood that burns on contact, the visual transformation of an amper is designed to be as horrifying as possible. Janet understood this. She staged the amper transformations as public spectacle for a reason. The visual impact of watching a dead thing's eyes go black and its body bulge with dark veins while it screams and thrashes against its restraints is the kind of image that controls a crowd. It tells people that the power of the living commands forces that are beyond natural, that Janet has dominion over something that everyone else fears. The amper's appearance was as much a political tool as its combat capabilities. Burners are visually subtler. They often look identical to standard walkers until you're close enough to see the slight discoloration of their skin or the faint chemical shimmer on their surfaces. This is what makes them uniquely dangerous, in a way that climbers and ampers are not. You can see a climber behaving differently. You can see an amper's black eyes and bulging veins. But a burner might look exactly like the 1,000 other walkers you've killed in your life, right up until the moment its hand closes on your arm and you feel your skin begin to dissolve. The first time Daryl encountered a burner, he had no warning. The walker looked normal, the touch did not. And by the time he understood what had happened, the damage was done, and the nuns at the convent had to cauterize the wound to save his arm. These visual distinctions matter because they tell you something about how the wildfire virus is changing its hosts at a physiological level. The clouded eyes of standard walkers indicate widespread neural deterioration. The retained pupils of climbers suggest some preservation of neural pathways that standard walkers have lost. The black eyes of ampers suggest a chemical saturation of the tissue that the serum produces, fundamentally altering the biology of the eye itself. The acidic skin of burners suggests a metabolic change at the cellular level. The walker's body chemistry shifted to produce corrosive compounds instead of the standard biological decay products. Each variant type represents a different pathway the virus has taken through its host's biology. And if each pathway can produce walkers this different from the baseline, then the total number of possible variant types is limited only by the number of biological pathways the virus can explore, which, given that it inhabits billions of hosts across every environment on Earth, is effectively unlimited. That is what Beale understood. That is what kept him awake at night and drove him to the monstrous decisions he made. Not the variants that already existed, but the variants that had not appeared yet. The ones cooking inside those billion Petri dishes, as he put it. The ones that the virus was still working on, deep inside the decaying bodies of the dead, combining with other pathogens, reacting to chemicals in the soil and the water and the air, producing combinations that no scientist had predicted, because no scientist had imagined a world where a single virus had this many hosts and this much time. The variant story is a story about walls that were never high enough and rules that were never permanent, and a world where the only constant is that the dead keep finding new ways to threaten the living. It is a story that started in a French laboratory with scientists who thought they could control what they had created, and it has not ended yet. The variants are out there. They have always been out there, from the very first day of the very first episode, when a little girl in a gas station parking lot in Georgia bent down and picked up a teddy bear and held it the way she had held it when she was alive. The dead were more than anyone realized. The virus was more complex than anyone understood. And in the Walking Dead universe, the things you do not understand are always the things that find you in the dark. But for now, the story has been told. Every variant, every mutation, every evolution, every weapon and every failure and every unanswered question. The complete history of the dead that changed, laid out from beginning to end, from a laboratory in France to the streets of the Commonwealth, from the fighting pits of Paris to the sewers of Manhattan, from a doorknob turning in the night to a wall being climbed in broad daylight. The world of The Walking Dead keeps turning. The dead keep changing. And somewhere, in the quiet of this moment, you can let it all settle. The story is told, the timeline is complete, the variants are documented and explained and catalogued, from the first to the most recent, from the least dangerous to the most terrifying. There is nothing left to worry about tonight, nothing left to figure out, just the slow, steady knowledge that you now know the full history of something that most people only ever understood in pieces. Rest now. The story will be here when you come back to it. The dead are not going anywhere. They never do. Sleep well.